Hi, everybody. Welcome to Attribution Part 1. So, attribution, I don't know if you remember when we first started, I asked you if you ever do people watching. Attribution has to do with why people do what they do. And it is kind of a subsection of the general concept of social perception, right? The way we perceive what other people are doing, our social perception. So this includes things like impression formation, what people are like, how we make impressions of other people, and how we manage the impressions that we make to other people. But it also includes the basic idea of attribution, which is why did people do that behavior? So beyond the idea of impression formation, attribution is going to get more specific than that. It's going to say, why did somebody do a specific behavior? And we'll talk about the different reasons why in a little while. But let's start with this general idea of how we make impressions about other people and what they are, who they are, and why they are. So let's start with this. I want you to look at this picture. What is this a picture of? Okay, that picture was an example of what we call Gestalt psychology. So I don't know if you remember when we talked about the history of social psychology. We talked about a lot of Gestalt psychologists leaving Germany and coming to the United States. And Gestalt is about perception, right? Perception, like with your eyeballs, perception. The idea is that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So if you said, when you looked at this picture, if you said, "Hey, that's a man," well, then you are using Gestalt psychology. You're saying, "Hey, I can tell that this is a man." In reality, that's just a bunch of fruits, right? It's a bunch of fruits and vegetables stuck together, and you, a human, take those different parts, you put them together, and you say, "Hey, the whole has more than the sum of its parts." There's something about the way these are arranged, the way they're put together, that makes the whole more than just a bunch of vegetables. That is Gestalt psychology. So people do not experience things in isolated pieces, like one potato, one mushroom, one clump of grapes. They see things in a meaningful picture as a whole. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. Gestalt psychology has to do with that. Now, when the Gestalt psychologists were kicked out of Germany, when they fled Germany, they came to the United States and then started to apply these same principles to social situations. And so when you think about how you understand what someone is, right, why they do what they do, what their personality is like, that kind of a thing, this is what they're trying to get at. They're saying, "Hey, you know what? It's not just you pick every single piece of information you have about the person and you add them up and that creates an exact idea of who they are. Instead, you use certain pieces in juxtaposition with other pieces to create a formation." So what do I mean by that? Let's talk about the early approaches of Gestalt psychology and Solomon Asch in 1946. Solomon Asch is very famous for his conformity study, which we'll talk about at a different time. But he was one of these guys who was looking at the idea of social Gestalt. That is how we understand socially what someone is doing and what the different pieces mean and do not mean. Let me give you the example. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to say, how much do you like this person? Okay? How much do you like this person? So, person one, go back, person one. Where did I lose person one? Okay. I don't know why I have a timer on this. Person one is intelligent. Come back, person one. Intelligent, skillful, industrious, warm, determined, practical, cautious. All right? So we're doing that kind of fast, kind of on purpose. All right? So how much do you like person one? All right. Now, let's talk about person two. I want you to rate how much you like person two. Person two is intelligent, skillful, industrious, cold, determined, practical, cautious. How much do you like person two? So Solomon Asch is saying that when we look at the impressions of people, it's not that we take every single trait and we combine them to create an exact idea of who they are. There seem to be some traits that are more important than others. Person one, I told you, was intelligent, skillful, industrious, warm, determined, practical, and cautious. Person two is intelligent, skillful, industrious, cold, determined, practical, and cautious. Consistently, people like person one better. But the only difference between these two people is the words warm and cold. Those are the only difference in the traits. Those are the only difference. So yeah, intelligent and skillful, those are all positive traits, but it seems that there is something about warm and cold that is more effective, more influential at creating an impression of the person. Solomon Asch calls those central traits. Those traits that are more influential, we call those central traits. And the other stuff we call peripheral traits. So it seems that when we form impressions of others, we're doing more than just adding up. Oh, intelligent? Yes. Industrial? Okay, good, got it. Warm? Yeah, got it. We're not adding all those up. Instead, there's these central traits like warm that is coloring or influencing the peripheral traits like industrious. If somebody is warm and industrious, then like, oh yeah, that's a really nice person who's going to go out there and be friendly and is motivated, warm and industrious. But if somebody is cold and industrious, we're like, ooh boy, look out for that person. Cold and industrious, all they do is work all the time. And they're probably doing evil stuff too because they're so cold, right? We form the impression of the entire person based off the interaction between the different pieces of information. So meaning the interaction between industrious and cold or industrious and warm. And that leads us to central traits, the ones that can color the other peripheral traits. Some traits are just more influential than others, and they influence the way we make these impression formations because they influence the way we understand how the traits work. Now, when we're creating an impression of somebody, what we're doing is we're actually creating a schema of that person. So what we're saying is that there's certain, fish in the school of fish, certain parts of that whole, network of information that seem to be influencing the way we see the other pieces of information. If somebody is warm and industrious, the warmth tends to color all those other peripheral traits. Cold is central, industrious, intelligent, etc. Those are peripheral. Okay, after Solomon Asch and the Gestalt psychologists, we need to talk about general impression formation by implicit personality theories. Remember, implicit, we were talking about the idea of a schema of someone, right? A schema can be a stereotype that can be primed even without you knowing it, and that can have an influence of the way that you interact with that person. Well, we make our impressions based off of some implicit ideas of personality. Now, here's what I want to do. I want you to think about these schemas of the ideas of how these kinds of traits go together. Now, these are going to be influenced by where and why and in what circumstance you're making these impressions. So, for example, if you're making an impression of somebody, right? Let's say that you meet Gina for the first time, and you find that Gina is helpful. Well, helpful by itself is good, but you are naturally going, do you remember balance theory? You're naturally going to want your impressions of things to be balanced with other things. So if Gina is helpful, then you are going to assume that she is also sincere, even though you may not have any influence or any information, any evidence that she is sincere. If you know that she's helpful, you're going to be influenced to think, oh, well, she's helpful, so I bet she's sincere as well. If somebody is beautiful physically, we often assume that they are also good. Now, notice how those two things, they shouldn't go together, right? I mean, they don't necessarily go together. Just because something is physically attractive doesn't mean that that person is a good person. But because we want to keep these things balanced, because we want our impressions of people to maintain a schema, right? Maintain a kind of a schema of someone, then we will assume things. So, for example, someone who's physically attractive, we assume that they are also a good person. In the fairy tales, often the witches are ugly because we associate ugliness with negative traits. Now, these is not necessarily fair. I'm not saying that these are fair, and then they're definitely not necessarily accurate, but we want to have our schemas of other people to be consistent. In the same way that we want balance theory, remember balance theory, We don't want things that are clashing. We don't want positive trait, beautiful, to clash with negative trait, evil. Beautiful and evil, oh, that sounds wrong. This allows us to make impressions quickly. When you make an impression of somebody, you create a schema of that person pretty fast. It takes a lot of effort to try and recreate the schema of somebody, right? It takes effort, and you don't want to spend those cognitive resources on things that you don't care about. So what you do is you create quick impressions, and you assume that if this person is nice, that they're also kind. Well, I guess kind and nice are like synonymous, right? So if they're nice, then they're also honest, for example. Okay? These are often also based on culture, stereotypes that we have about what fits with what. So your culture says, oh, well, in all the fairy tales, someone who is beautiful is also kind, right? And that can change based off of what your cultural expectations might be. All right, so let's talk about cognitive ways of understanding impression formation. This also gets to ideas of motivation that we've been discussing before. So these are kind of building on each other, if you've noticed. So let's tell you about Frank. Now, this is an actual example of a study that people did. So this is not me making up this example. This is actually how the study was originally done. So what they did is they gave information about Frank. And in Frank, they always called him a former schizophrenic. Now, we probably wouldn't say that nowadays, but let's just say that he's somebody who had suffered from schizophrenia, but it's definitely under control now. Frank is also friendly, intelligent, likes to bike, and he loves animals. Or they would tell this about Frank. He's a former schizophrenic, the same information. He has 2 younger sisters. He lives in suburban DC. He likes to bike. He drives a Honda, right? So when you see these 2 descriptions of Frank, do you like Frank more or less depending on the descriptions? Well, what they found is that when you ask people for the liking for Frank, that people tended to like Frank more when he was friendly, intelligent, likes to bike, and loves animals. Makes sense, right? But that actual impression difference depended on the motivation of the person making the impression. In a separate circumstance, Frank was actually just as likable if he was friendly, intelligent, loves to bike and animals, as if he had 2 sisters, lives in suburban DC, likes to bike and drives a Honda, right? When those 2 things were equal, they could be equal, or they could be, there could be more. And this is the reason why. It all depends on the motivation of the person making the evaluation of Frank. So let's say that you are making this evaluation of Frank, but let's say that you are an employer and Frank is applying for a job. When you are highly motivated to process the information, so that says outcome dependent, right? So the outcome of your evaluation really is important, right? The outcome of this, depends on how you make this evaluation. Then the positive individuating information will lead to a better impression of Frank. So if you remember, there's a stereotype about people who've suffered from schizophrenia, right? But if I give you positive individuating information, right, that he's kind, that he's, let's see what we said, I can't even remember, friendly, intelligent, loves to bike, and loves animals, those are positive things. So you take that stereotype you have of schizophrenia, right, and then you say, oh, okay, well, but now I have this positive individuating information. I actually like him more than if I had what we call neutral individuating information. So this information has 2 younger sisters, lives in suburban DC, likes to bike, drives a Honda. Those are neutral. They're not positive or negative. They just describe him, right? Okay, you're not better or worse because you happen to have 2 sisters and you happen to live in suburban Washington, D.C., right? When people didn't have a stake in the game, when they were not an employer, when it didn't really matter what impression they made of Frank, then Frank was equally liked with the positive information as he was with the neutral information. It was dependent on the motivation of the person making the impression. If you were the employer and this actually mattered for your business, you were highly motivated, The individuating positive information was more important to you and you liked Frank more. If you didn't really care, you just make an impression of Frank and it didn't really matter, then it didn't matter. Neutral or positive, didn't matter. All right, let me ask you this then. Oh, I'm not asking you anything right now, sorry. Let's talk about this idea of impression formation. So what we've talked about so far with the Gestalt and all that stuff, we talked about how people create impressions of each other. So the impression formation is based off of the attention that you give it. So what we saw with Frank, etc., was based off of the attention that we give it, based off of our motivation. So people form impressions on the least effortful resources possible, right? So if you don't want to make a big impression, right, don't want to have to scrutinize Frank, then you won't do it. You just take the information that's there. Oh, you know, Frank's good enough, okay? And you go with it. If, though, you are motivated to do so, like you're an employer making this decision, then you're more likely to scrutinize the information. These also correspond to your motives and desires, right? So they correspond to the way that the impressions that you already have and other motives and desires that you have. Certain traits are going to be more important, more impactful, I should say, than others. And this includes ideas of values, which actually lead people to tend to neglect something like how competent they are. Industrious, intelligent, that kind of a thing. So, Gestalt psychology we talked about. That was the first one with Ash, right? We form impressions based off the entire person in the interaction. This is central peripheral traits. The second thing we talked about was implicit personality theories, right? The idea of balance, that we like things to go together, to stay together, right? Positive goes with positive, negative goes with negative. We want to keep those consistent. And then finally, the cognitive approach says that we are going to make our impressions based off of our motivations, right? How much attention and memory we want to give to this particular process. Now I want to ask you this. Do you try to influence what people think about you? If you said no to this, then I think you're lying. Of course you do. Of course you do. Almost everybody wants people to like them, right? Or at least wants them to think a certain way about them. So if you said no about this, maybe you say, oh, you know, I don't conform to what other people think about me. You're probably trying to influence the way I think about you if you said that. We do this all the time. Now, we talked a lot about ideas of self-presentation, how we manage the impressions that people make about us. This attempt that we have, people attempt to convey information about our image of ourselves to other people, right? I want you to think that I am, and then you fill in the blanks. Attractive, intelligent, whatever it happens to be, funny, I don't know, whatever it happens to be. We want people to think these things. It's really important for us that people have these impressions. Now, remember when we talked about the self? Remember how we talked about how thoughts and the motivations that we have about ourselves, we really like to understand what other people think about us, and we like to understand how other people see us so that we can create a self-concept? Well, this is part of that process. We want to construct a self-image and identity, a self-concept, and we want that to be positive. We want to influence other people to also gain rewards. I don't know, money, stature, status, grades, whatever it happens to be. How do we do this? Well, there's lots of different ways. The main motivation of self-enhancement means wanting to think well of yourself, right? So self-enhancing, enhancing ourself. How do we do it? Well, we take information that we can and make sure that it is self-enhancing. We also might enhance our impressions of other people that we are associated with. So if you think awesome things about my wife, that makes me look better because I and my wife, our identities are mixed with each other. Our self-concepts overlap because she's part of my self-concept, I'm part of her self-concept. We also do other things like self-handicapping so that we can blame failure on outside influences, external causes. And then there's always a trade-off then between favorability and plausibility, right? So you need to also remember that besides self-enhancement, we also have self-verification. So not only, we don't just go around and say, oh, you know, I am the supreme dictator of the world and I have superpowers, because that's not very plausible, right? That's not very plausible. So we want to think well of ourselves. We want to think that we're awesome, but we also want to be correct. And so the plausibility part is part of it. We have to know that this is true, because that's a big motivation for us. This can all be affected by our cognitive resources, right? What we have availability to us and how we allocate those resources. Okay, I think that is it. Let's go ahead and stop